Hello, and welcome to the studios at Mayo Clinic, where the National Press Foundation is training journalists about obesity and health. Today we'll give you a short course on all aspects of obesity.
The National Press Foundation is a nonprofit dedicated to helping journalists cover complex topics with depth and accuracy. Our mission includes journalists around the U.S. and around the world.
I'm Sandy Johnson, President of the National Press Foundation. With me today is Dr. James Levine, a Mayo Clinic researcher and co-director of the Mayo Clinic Arizona State University Obesity Solutions. Dr. Levine is a respected expert on the issue of obesity, which is a national health crisis. Dr. Levine, let's start by drawing a picture of the state of obesity today and how the trend lines has changed over time.
Well, I mean, first of all, we know that since 1980, both in multiple high-income, middle and low-income countries, worldwide obesity rates have doubled. Now, I'm honored to work around the world. So for example, just to set a picture, in Beijing, 1 in 2 children have obesity. In India, obesity rates are increasing so quickly that the healthcare implications have the capability of stultifying the growing economy in India. In the United States, so we have a lot of programs in quite challenged communities, and for example, just recently we were with one of our Latino communities. 1 in 3 children already have elevated blood pressure associated with carrying excess body weight. And so when we think about those global statistics that 1.9 billion people in the world have or are battling with obesity, 39% of adults aged 18 or over are overweight in 2014 globally, and 13% have obesity. In the United States, already 1 in 3 people are battling obesity. Those are numbers, those are statistics. But what this really drills down to is that every single family in America is battling with the issue of excess body weight and how to deal with it.
Mm-hmm. And how has that changed over the last 10 or 20 years?
Almost in so interesting. The trouble is when you spent sort of a quarter of a century working in an area, to talk about the fact that, you know, the work of colleagues, societies, communities, families, individuals continues to go on, and yet numbers continue to climb.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
There are some experts who argue that obesity rates have reached such high rates that we've got to the point where everybody, if you like, the system is swamped. We're almost running out of people who can potentially develop obesity because the problem is societal wide. I mean, think about it. 2 out of 3 people have excess body weight in society. So if you're standing in a bus stop, right, and the normal bus stops I stand in here in Phoenix, you know, have let's say 10 people in them, that means that 3 out of 10 people in the bus stop already have high blood glucose, already predicating type 2 diabetes. Already somebody in that bus line has type 2 diabetes. Almost a half of those individuals will have blood pressure higher than they need. And most of those individuals will be suffering stress levels that are higher than they should cope with or bear. And so the issue, again, so to me, on one hand, you could sort of say, this is just overwhelming. Society is swamped with excess body weight and its implications. But on the other hand, you have to look at our families and our communities and our work colleagues and our kids in our schools and say there are things that work and we have to do them. Mm-hmm. Because otherwise you get a sense of hopelessness.
Mm-hmm. A couple of states, Colorado, California, Vermont, have lower than the national average rates of obesity. What are people in those states doing right?
Well, I mean, I think one needs to be I wouldn't use the word cautious, but you need to be thoughtful about how you look at any statistics, right? So when you say, for example, the state of Colorado, let's take that as an example. The type of people who live in Colorado and have done so for many, many generations have a different sort of are very exercise prone. There are some quite high wealth pockets in Colorado, but also within the state of Colorado, interestingly, are some very poverty-dense pockets where obesity rates are exceedingly high. So I think statewide data are tempting to look at and to try and tease hope or concern out of, but I'm actually not a big fan of that, because often the real stories are hidden within these statewide statistical analyses. One of the most interesting data sets that I have seen on that national focus, which is, I think, very, very interesting, is where zip code data are looked at, where what actually happens is you take a given zip code and you look at different health variables within that zip code. And to me, that's quite a granular way of going away from the state concept, because a state, is quite difficult to look at, and to look at individual zip codes. So people, and the reason we know that is important, just think of where you live, or where I live, or where any of us live. The people living around us probably have sort of quite similar socioeconomic indicators to ourselves, which is how we find ourselves living there. And again, that's true of many zip codes. So very poverty-dense zip codes, it's an area. It's almost like a big community. So when you look at zip code data are very, very consistent. In zip codes with high income, obesity rates are less. In zip codes with high income, obesity rates are less. Sedentariness rates are less as well. In zip codes with very high income, obesity rates are less, sedentary rates are less, violence is less, drug dealing is less, police arrests are less. Conversely, in the poorest areas in the United States, in the most challenged areas in the United States, in the zip codes with lowest median household income, obesity rates are far greater. And in fact, so there's a correlation, there's a direct relationship. Obesity rates are far greater than in the wealthier zip codes. And similarly, sedentariness rates are greater. People are more sedentary, less active. Violence rates are greater. And all those other link-ins, all those other sociological demographics also associate with zip codes with very, very high poverty, obesity, sedentariness rates. And to me, that's quite an instructful way of thinking through the obesity map in the United States.
The zip code and county level data, is that CDC data for our journalists who are watching?
That is CDC data and is public domain information.
And what about obesity by gender or ethnicity? What do the trend lines look like there?
Well, I think one has to be, I'm quite cautious about, so gender it most often means men and women in general. And so generally what you're going to see is that the differentiator between men and women, interestingly, sometimes different. The reason I'm slightly hesitant is you'll read different studies show slightly different things. Some studies will say obesity rates in men are growing faster than in women. Some will say obesity rates in women are growing faster than men. But what you need to do when you start looking at those data is to really look about what part of that global data set we're looking at. Because differentiate, if you start with a community where there's a lot of leanness, where people are starting out lean, the rate of obesity development is going to be different potentially in genders based on other socioeconomic factors. So the point I'm trying to get at is, again, when you're looking at data sets for the United States, my reiteration is to be quite careful. There's no implicit reason that the rates of obesity for men and women should be different unless there are specific undercutting issues that need to be thought through in terms of causality. Now, what's the latest trend in data? One of the things I was thinking about preparing for this is to try and think of what are the new things. And if you start looking, what the most interesting thing about how obesity statistics are now being used is more to say is how different scenarios, disease states, are associated with obesity that haven't previously been identified. So if you feel like one of the examples of this is fatty liver, which may not be something many people have even thought about or considered. This is where the liver gathers excess fat within it, and that can predicate to cirrhosis. Now, the biggest shift in the whole issue of liver disease in the United States is obesity. Yeah. And this is now, it's almost like this is a revelation, but for those of us working with patients, we've seen fatty liver for years. And so these specific statistical associations with cancer, types of cancer, subdivisions of cancer, different cancers in women and men, new types of diseases not previously associated with fatty liver, depression, and so on and so forth, are, I think, very interesting areas of endeavor trying to understand how obesity impacts the health space.
You started out by mentioning a few other nations in the United
Correct.
States. So what are the underlying cultural and societal issues that, that Mexico and China and India now have such rising rates of obesity?
I think one's got to be very, very careful, again, to be thoughtful, because the immediate and obvious response is to say this. Look at China, look at India, and similarly Mexico. Economic development is exceedingly powerful for national development, for national pride, for national presence, national success, elimination of poverty, disparity issues. And so, of course, understandably, and of course rightly, nation by nation are looking at ways to become more financially successful. And I would add into your short shopping list sub-Saharan Africa. Right? The African nations are developing at remarkable speed as well. Now, if you look back at the history of Western society, Europe, the Industrial Revolution, and the economic powerhouse that is now the beautiful United States of America, in a way the same story is told, but it's just fast forward and faster speed. Because with industrialization in Europe, when people migrated from agricultural communities, ways of life that we can't even remember anymore, into urban centers, they gave up walking to schools, walking for socialization for 4 or 5 hours a day, to everything being physically localized. Then there was modernization of factories and offices, where people, of course, became sedentary. And then, of course, getting food supplies in high enough density, food density, high density foods. These things are calories, but they are appropriate. That is the story of how obesity emerged across the United States and across Europe. Now, that same sequence of events has exactly happened in Beijing and in India, at a much faster pace, however. The speed of urbanization in China, with government projections and supports to support the industrial growth, hundreds of millions of people are being urbanized from agricultural, admittedly poor lifestyles in rural China into the cities. And as a consequence, taking that same map as occurred in Europe and in the United States, that same map is happening. Shorter transition times, generally by road, by gas-powered transportation, office-based work, factory-based work, and now modern factories are far more robotic than even the factories of the 40s and 50s. Right? And in fact, conveyor belts are actually lowered now to chair height so that people can sit and work. So conveyor belts aren't even now standing manual work. And that process has become so fast as intense. Plus, part of being successful is the allure, right, of being Americanized. When McDonald's first opened in Beijing, I happened to be there because I was like, it was actually a coincidence, but of course I was there. There were the queues, I think the opening time, if I remember correctly, was around noon, but the queue started at 5 a.m. And I literally met migrant workers in China who paid a month salary to get a McDonald's burger in a box, and they kept the box as a memento. I kid you not. So part of this industrial sort of urbanization, sedentary, high-fat fast food is also the allure of success. And one hates to say that part of that allure implicitly, subtly, has become an obesity epidemic. But us, I would argue, as a creative, innovative, dynamic, thoughtful, amazing country, need to innovate ourselves out of the obesity issue into a sort of a, if you like, the promised land of greater health and greater opportunity.
And how does obesity affect how long you'll live?
Well, I mean, again, it's difficult to give you a new spin on an old established issue. I mean, the health consequences of obesity, I mean, to put it in the most simple sense, obesity impacts every single organ in the body. Mm-hmm. And as I said, the only new spin on obesity statistics, apart from trying to understand the granularity and causality of the data using sort of a metadata approach, is to recognize that there are even more health consequences, I'm afraid, associated with obesity. And as the viewership knows, this is the first generation that's going to live less time than the last generation. But again, to me, living long isn't necessarily what this is all about, right? To me, again, so I'm thinking, as I talk to you, I'm thinking of patients, right? Again, to understand the burden, mums come to see us. So I work in many underserved communities. Mums come to see us, terribly overweight, but she doesn't come to talk because she's thinking about her insulin shots or how to get the equipment and the programs, whatever. The reason she's coming to see me and chat is because her daughter, age 14, who also has obesity, has just been prescribed insulin for adult type 2 diabetes. There are rare genetic causes of that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a new tsunami of children with adult type 2 diabetes with early blood pressure, on blood pressure medications. And she's coming to me, using her time with me to say, what can you do for my daughter? And that's quite a profound issue. So we're now talking about multi-generational impact on quality of life. Mm-hmm. The biggest predictor of QOL, quality of life, is actually health. And again, you might say, well, it's obvious. I mean, God forbid anyone listening to this or watching this has any illness, right? But we all know how illness impacts us. And yes, of course, cancer is... my mum just wrote a book about her journey through cancer. And when I read what she wrote about how she interacted with her kids, that's my brother and I, illness doesn't even touch that. It's like that mother and her daughter. Illness touches families. It touches our work colleagues, the people who love us, our friends. And so, yeah, people with obesity live less time, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about a national impact of disease, a burden of disease, preventable, that impacts every single family. Every single family could be a little bit brighter and a little bit happier if we could unfold this, from all the different angles that we're aware of, that things that work.
Mm-hmm. You touched on diabetes. What other illnesses are likely to, or what is the higher risk for people who are obese? What other illnesses?
I mean, I know that together you and I have now a 6-hour window to discuss these issues. And so what I'm going to do over the next 6 hours is break down for you the following types of disorders, and we'll go through each. We'll take 2 hours to discuss each of these categories of illness, not individual illnesses, because I'll need 14 hours to discuss those. So there are the metabolic disorders, there are the malignancies, there are the joint disorders, there are the psychological impacts, and we're going to spend 2 hours discussing each. So let's first talk about the metabolic disorders, whether that's cardiovascular disease, diabetes, hypertension, and so on and so on and so forth. We could talk about the cancers, certain types of malignancy are specifically associated with obesity. Talk about depression, low mood, low energy being affected with obesity, all the joint problems. And that's not even just degenerative arthritis. That's worsening of rheumatoid arthritis for those with rheumatoid. That's dysarthria, joint pains, back problems, chronic. We're talking about disordered sleep and so on. And so the catalogue of... But what's interesting to me, and again, this is coming out now, it's those things we know about and the healthcare costs associated with them, understandably and obviously, are $1 trillion price tags. Mm-hmm. What's interesting is, and lost work is the obvious thing that people pick up on.
Your $1 trillion figure, does that include lost productivity?
There are actually complex analyses published that break down direct costs, indirect costs. And again, once we finish the 14 hours discussing all of these different health things, we can then spend another 6 hours discussing the magnitude of the economic impact. But what we do know, coming bringing it back down to families, bringing it back down to individuals, is that when you go into a family, and I'm talking about sometimes families on median household, on our household income are in the 30 to 40 range, right? These people are not on high incomes, who have taken on as a family healthy cooking. We're going to do a family walk on Sundays after dinner. The biggest reason parents use public libraries is to send their kids to a program there. Work offers us a discount on a gym. I'm going to try that out and when you go into a family that's sort of taking this on as a mission, it's not so much that the gloom and doom is gone, it's just you feel the energy and the brightness. And that energy and brightness, very interestingly, in the corporate space now, when you bring in corporate programs, whether those are movement and or nutrition, healthy cafeterias and so on, are associated with increases in productivity in the 11 to 15% range. And this is number of loans processed per hour as an example of productivity.
Say that again.
So when you bring in healthy work, whether that's active work, which we can talk about in a while if you like, or a dynamic nutritional environment in the workplace, but generally it's most often now active work with a healthy nutrition component. Actual productivity improves about 10 to 15%.
For an individual?
For a company.
For a company.
For a company. One hopes. Of course, companies are collections of individuals. We know that, right? And the individuals are the most important, right? Importantly, and I think perhaps more importantly, when you look at the school data, you see the same thing. When you move in active schooling, that can be a classroom or a school, the grades of the kids, forget the health variables for now, forget that, the grades of the children compared to age and sex match peers improve about 10%. And we're talking about many, many studies now. So children learn better. So as we think about the United States, and I think there's a tendency, particularly talk about obesity, I bet you, for people listening to this, you mentioned the word obesity, and already there are these suppositions and premonitions and self-blame issues already covering the glasses so that one sees less clearly, because the concept has carries such negative connotations. Even for us as individuals, we feel stigmatized. People are stigmatized because of their body weight. People are discriminated against because of their body weight. People feel when they go into a gym that people are looking at them negatively because of their body weight. And people who are thin discriminate against people with obesity for inane and inexcusable reasons. They are arguing to themselves, we hear, that person doesn't take as good care of them as I take of myself. This is unacceptable. This is how people think. And so when one thinks about obesity in the context of society, and I bet you that the listenership today are jaded by these negative thoughts. But if only we were to realize that by taking on this issue as a mandate, a national, individual, personal mandate, family mandate, the opportunities for us as individuals, as families, as companies, as societies, as communities, to get stronger, healthier, more productive, smarter, are enormous. And if we were to spin the issue as an opportunity to empower ourselves as individuals, families, and nations, then you would see a dramatic shift in action. Because at the end of the day, the statistics ain't budging until we do something.
What research has there been into individual responsibility or families taking responsibility for a problem with weight?
It's very, very, very interesting. So in a way, without trying to, I've sort of I didn't mean to, happened by accident. When you live this life, this is what we do, right? Stigmatization is one of these issues that, so I'm honored. I have an amazing life. I'm honored. One of the many honors I have, working in science is a calling, and the people we work with and the communities we bring information to and learn from are. But the most moving experiences are what patients share with you. And the first thing I'll say, so when you're in clinic and you're sitting across the table from somebody with battling obesity, and we, of course, have patients fill out their prior experiences. So it struck me very early on in my career. I met this patient, a young lady from north of Minnesota, different state. And she actually is the average. The average patient we see in clinic has tried 17 things to lose weight before, in this case, this lady actually came to me in clinic. 17 things. Now, I'll disclose to you, haven't told anyone else. You guys don't listen now. This is private. I wrote an application, go to Juilliard. I didn't get in. I never tried again. The work I put into that application was substantial. The work I put into that application to fail to get into Juilliard was not as substantial as one attempt made by one of my patients to lose weight. Now, my average patient, this lady in particular, young lady in particular, had made 17 attempts to lose weight. And here she was coming back again.
Meaning that's how hard it is?
Very politely. To say, I don't think, to me, climbing Everest is hard, right? That is hard in my mind. My patients have climbed Everest 17 times. That is the magnitude of the battle. And so I'm telling you, when I hear people, and I assure you, even in the street, in a restaurant, in the public space, on a bus, I'm a big public transport guy. When I hear people make negative comments about my patients with obesity, they're not trying, they don't take personal responsibility, I will confront. I say, have you got any idea how tough it is for somebody living in this modern society who has a proneness to gain excess body weight, who lives in this stressful soup of challenges to maintain a healthy body weight? Often one salary, 3 jobs, 4 children, poor access to means, opportunities, a stressful community space. In other words, the threat of going outside and what, God forbid, could happen to your kids if they're trying to get to the playground because drugs are being dealt and guns are going off. Right? And so the idea that personal responsibility is an issue is a banality to me, because my patients climb Everest 17 times before they get to see me.
Well, let's talk about one of your theories of weight loss, and that is your theory of NEAT, N-E-A-T.
So, very politely, NEAT is not a theory of weight loss. That's not what we claim at all. NEAT is non-exercise activity thermogenesis. Now, that's the calories a person burns in their everyday life. Now, the reason NEAT is important, and I know I have another 2.5 hours to discuss this with you. The reason NEAT is important is for, if I may, just hit some highlights. We know that NEAT levels when people worked in agriculture was far higher than when we urbanized. For example, when people come from agricultural communities, we actually measured this in Jamaica. The places people go for work, I know, the things I do for science are unbelievable, but I'm there. But when people migrate seriously from agricultural communities in Jamaica into Kingston, which is the capital, and take on desk jobs, just by doing that, no programs, they halve the amount of walking they do, they double their sitting time. When you compare lean people in Kingston, Jamaica, in a desk job, Kingston, Jamaica, imagine, versus Rochester, Minnesota, in a desk job, lean people are sitting the same amount of time. Lean people in Rochester, Minnesota, are sitting 2.5 hours less than people battling obesity. And so, importantly, you see this huge differential in sitting time, and what you say of sitting time is the opposite to walking time for people living in agricultural communities. So in other words, the bad news is that we have urbanized, we've put people in desks behind screens, and they are sitting 3 times more than they should be, walking 3 times less, threefold difference we're talking about. The good news is the human being is built to move an awful lot more than we do. Now, high NEAT, non-exercise activity thermogenesis, a person with high NEAT is a person who burns a lot of calories moving. A person with low NEAT sits all day long. Now, what's really cool is that NEAT, non-exercise activity thermogenesis, the movement of everyday living, isn't simply a reflection of the threefold differential as we've urbanized and taken to our seats and developed, unfortunately, diabetes and all these other things we've spoken about. There's also a science of NEAT, because when you take a group of lean people and you overfeed them, everybody by the same number of 1,000 extra calories a day, some people can switch on their NEAT, like going into 5th gear, right? Can switch on their NEAT and burn off literally 80% of those extra calories through movement. Other people, when they overfeed, because we all overfeed from time to time, let's face it, other people, when they overfeed, cannot switch on their NEAT, and they gain excess body fat that much quicker. And so therefore, it isn't a surprise that people with obesity are sitting more, have lower NEAT, non-exercise activity thermogenesis, and it appears that NEAT is a very important, if you like, trigger or differentiator between those with obesity and those who are lean. And remember, it's being modulated so that those people who can switch on their NEAT stay lean for longer, people who can't develop more and more and more excess body weight. And so, yes, society has an impact, but also biology too, because we know from the neuroscientists who've taught us that the brain has amazing modulatory capacity between appetite and NEAT. These things are sort of counterbalanced right at the heart of the brain. And so what's cool and what's important is, yes, activating people, getting them up and moving is tremendously important for people battling excess body weight. But also, it's also important for those of us who are lean as well. Sedentariness is associated, the sitting disease, if you like, is associated with cardiovascular risk, high blood pressure, and all these other things, even if a person is lean. And so what's really interesting about I would call the activity revolution, the NEAT revolution that we're about to see, that we're currently living in, is that it benefits everybody.
And are there ways that people can turn that on, like you described?
Great question. So, and it triggers back to, the answer is, if you create environments that enable people to be more active, they will become more active. Now, you might say that's almost a slightly trite way of looking at the world, but it isn't. I'll explain why. I may want to, let me give a real example. I get, my life is email like everybody, right? I got a fantastic email from a lady working in New York City. And she explained to me she worked in Cubeland, and she read the book, and so on and so forth, and she wanted to get this active lifestyle. And it was just, for some bizarre reason, I sent her a nice email back saying, thank you. I sent her a couple of references, and I don't know how, because this doesn't usually happen. She somehow actually, the next thing I knew is the phone was going, and I had the operator saying, I've got this phone call for you, and it's this person. I was like, whoa, okay, so we chatted. And I don't know how she did it, but she broke through all my systems. I don't know how she did it. Anyway, so we chat, and to cut a long story short, we were talking, she said, I want to do active walk and talk meetings, no equipment. I want to hold my meetings with my boss, walk and talk. And I said, well, have you ever asked him? He said, yeah, I asked him. He said, no. She had the intent. She took the personal responsibility. She even challenged her boss. And her boss said no. And that's a simple example. So that's what I mean. So people have an urge, a sense that they want to get up and move. But we need the infrastructures to enable them to do so, right? And that's true of all aspects of health, in fact. I mean, instructing in a rather sort of paternalistic way, you should be healthy, right? Right? That's not the way. That's not the way we function, right? That's not the way we are as thinking, interactive adults and children. We want to be healthy. It's intuitive. We want to be healthy. We want to do good for ourselves. We want to do good for our neighbours. We want to do good for our families. We want to do good for our country. Unless, however, the facilities, the capabilities, the support is necessary. We're not talking about money, right? The boss of that lady who somehow got hold of me from New York, and I'll never ever work out how she did it, but anyway, she did, because otherwise would have closed it down by now. But anyway, but she did. She needed her boss to simply say, yes, we can have our meeting, walk and talk. You see what I mean? And so it is that mixture of personal will, personal lust to be active, healthy, dynamic. We know from this data that if you actually create these environments, children are amazing. If you give children that freedom to move during their school day, it can be done in multiple ways. They will double without no programs. Just you guys can move if you want to. Teachers encourage. They will double their daily physical activity. Double. Adults, if you create dynamic offices, people will get up and move, and it's actually really cool. Just over 2 hours extra a day, which is exactly the obesity gap. And so there are fantastic opportunities now in society to start leveraging these tools, these technologies, these approaches, these measurement technologies, these behavioral strategies to get people up moving healthier and ultimately more productive and smarter.
You have talked about Big Mac and a shake and using that as an analogy for, so why don't you explain that?
Well, when we did our original overfeeding studies, we did these studies in very, very carefully regulated laboratory environments where we provide every single food for our subjects to eat. There are very few facilities in the world that can do this. At Mayo Clinic, we have some other, the National Institutes of Health have them too. And other centres as well. I mean, when we give our subjects food, it's first of all, it's based on their preferences. It's what they like to eat. Because otherwise, you can't understand people unless you bend to their will. But then every food that person has selected, we chemically analyze that food to work out not what's on the packet, but better, what really are the caloric macronutrient contents. So we know exactly how much food people require to keep their body weight steady. What we can then do, once you know that, is we can then overfeed people to see how different people respond in these intricate scientific endeavors. Similarly, you can calorically restrict people and work out how the body responds to caloric restriction. Now, one of the experiments we did, famously the one you're referring to, is where we took healthy individuals and we overfed them by an excess 1,000 calories a day. Now, so if I had 2,700 calories to keep my body weight steady, I went to 3,700 calories a day. Now, initially, you might be aghast. That's horrific, you might say. I mean, how can a person sustain that amount of extra food? But the trouble is, and not the concerning issue, but the truth is, that an extra 1,000 calories a day could simply be eating your meals and then on the way home, stopping off at a fast food restaurant, it doesn't matter which one it is, and taking a large hamburger with some cheese and all the fillings and a milkshake. And that may be all that is necessary to be equivalent to an extra 1,000 calories.
1,000 calories. Yeah.
Now, what's important about that observation is, as you're listening to this and thinking about this, is to recognize that we all have bad days. We all have bad days. There's always also the week that it's somebody's 40th birthday and they bring in that gorgeous, chocolate gâteau, forest gâteau or something, right, with circles. I'm thinking of it right now, it's little trillions of circles of chocolate on the top. And everyone sings happy birthday and there's a group hug and all this wonderful stuff. And you munch down and the second slice isn't quite as good as the first. We know that, right? Right. But without thinking about it, because this is how life is, you've consumed 600-700 calories. Now, don't tell me that all of those people who've consumed the couple of slices of chocolate forest gâteau or the extra milkshake, whatever it may be, doesn't matter, then instantly go and work it off, right? because it was Jilly's 40th birthday on Tuesday, and now it's Johnny's 50th birthday on Thursday. I hope they're going to bring in that chocolate cake again. The point I'm making is that it is terribly easy in modern society, where there is so much access to calorie-dense, delicious, yummy food, that overfeeding at this level that we use as a sort of a scientific paradigm of an excess 1,000 calories a day, which sounds a lot, but in reality is a challenge that many of us are faced with many, many days of the year. Mm-hmm. Now, that being the case, it's important to bear in mind, therefore, that if I do the chocolate gâteau and a milkshake and this and that over a year, right, that's only, what, a couple of times a month, all of a sudden my body is challenged with 10 pounds of weight gain. Mm-hmm. Now, my body's natural tendency, based on that thing in the hypothalamus I was talking about, might be to increase my NEAT, move more and burn it off without me even thinking about it, which is exactly, appears to be how the body does it. However, if I am in an office and my boss won't let me do a walk and talk meeting, and I'm stuck behind a screen all day and I do my shopping on the internet, and the only way I talk to my kids is on Facebook, right? My body's natural tendency to burn off the intermittent access to excess calories is never going to be realized, mm-hmm. right? And that, in a way, is the danger, is the subtlety of all of this, right? And often that subtlety, we haven't even touched on that subtlety mm-hmm. yet, because now imagine Jilly's birthday, chocolate gâteau. I've just come out of that sedentary meeting with my boss, and my boss has totally chewed me out. Whatever reason. You can imagine me, I'm an awful employee. You can't imagine. No, I'm not. I'm a terrific employee, for the record. No, I'm speaking to a journalist. But we've all had bad discussions with our bosses. We all know.
Stressful days.
An awful day. Imagine, right? An awful day. And now I'm at Jilly's birthday party. Everyone's in a good mood. And I've had my first piece of chocolate gâteau, and I'm making a decision in my mind to have a second piece. It's just been the most awful day, and you can just imagine reaching for that second piece of cake, right? And then I get home and my partner says, hey, do you fancy a beer? You're looking a bit down. Yeah, I'll have a beer. And all of, I mean, those stresses, in the same way that we're exposed to joyous mm-hmm. calorie mm-hmm. bursts, right. Now that's joy. Twice a month. Stress, most of us, right, get every single day. Mm-hmm. Now, imagine you're a person who eats in response to stress. And there's all this, the M&Ms on the desk, the Big Mac on the way home, all of it, right? And somehow our body feels the comfort as we eat perhaps a high fat or a little snack, whatever it may be. And now you think, well, how can I impact my stress? Well, I've got to keep my job. That's how I pay my mortgage. And my boss wants me to do that extra report because we cut down on ancillary staff, and so I've got to pick up extra slack. And I don't know how I'm going to fit that in. I've also got to get the kids to soccer. And I've got a second job because we want to take a vacation this year if we can afford it, right? And all of a sudden you start to get a picture of a lifestyle that all of a sudden this issue of health and regulation and stuff and active and it says is so irrelevant because I'm just trying to live. Mm-hmm. And now you take that scenario and you bring it into a poverty-dense region. Remember the zip codes, and people in poorer zip codes have higher rates of obesity, more sedentariness. And now look at the statistics for stress, right? And now you're sitting at home and your 14-year-old son has taken out a handgun, and I can assure you this is not rare. I assure you this is not rare, and slap the handgun on the kitchen table. Many kids carry guns in America, and the mum says, take that off the table. Not where did you get it? Take that, we don't have that on the table. Mm-hmm. And you're sitting and you're listening to gun volleys going off. Gun volleys going off. Your kids, you're too terrified to let them go out. Think of the stress of, you don't even want your kids to go outside, but they're all angst. So they're eating because they're stressed and they're anxious. You're eating because the kids are stressed, and you've got to get to your third job, which is across town. And how are you going to get there? And you don't want the kids to go out at night, but they might. And there's a drug dealer at the end of the road. And now you're starting to get a tableau, a canvas, that the picture isn't, the picture we're painting is not a piece of cake and is not an exercise, a walking path, right? The tableau is a whole series of clouds, a whole series of challenges, a whole series of stresses, of angst, of misery, of responses. And how is that lady who's so worried about all of this stuff, who finally gets home, and I've met this person, that's what I'm telling you about her, and she finally gets home at 12:40 every single night. That's just before 1 a.m. And she tries to get to sleep. She falls asleep and she's woken up by a gun volley. How's she going to get a good quality sleep? How's she going to get time for breakfast when she can barely get the packaged lunches for her kids ready to go to school?
Do you want to talk a little bit about insomnia and obesity?
Yeah. One of the things that is, at this point, I would say irrevocable, the knowledge is good. We know that part of a healthy person is to get good quality sleep. Now, what's interesting, first of all, though, let's just deal with something very quickly and importantly. And let's get that out of the way quickly. First of all, associated with obesity per se are specific sleep conditions. And the reason this is important is they're actually very frequently undiagnosed. And the big one, and there are others, but the big one is obstructive sleep apnea. And on the radio all the time now you hear about sleep apnea masks. So it's treatable. It's treatable with these machines, but it has to be diagnosed. So it's one of the things that's missed quite frequently in patients with obesity. But anyway, let's deal with that because that's a separate issue. Now, assuming that that's not the issue, good quality sleep, and everyone's different. I tell you, everyone's different. Some people are 3-hour sleepers. They just are. Some people are 8-hour sleepers. They just are. And children need sleep. Probably more than adults because their brain, and it really is true, their brains are growing and actually they're doing the repairing at night. And so we know that good quality sleep not only impacts grades and productivity at work, like we didn't know that, right? You know, falling asleep at 2 o'clock in the afternoon in front of your desk is not productive. I don't think you need me to tell you that. But good quality sleep, interestingly, also affects appetite. Now, the studies that show this are like really amazing. Listen to this, right? So again, so you can look at the statistics and you can see sleep, obesity, bad sleep, obesity tracking each other. But here's how it actually happens. And this has been studied, again, intricately on some of these research centers. Amazing, amazing studies. They took a group of people and they sleep deprived them on a research center. They knew how many hours sleep they required for normal, for happiness. And they sleep deprived them by 30%. And that was done scientifically. I mean, people were nudging, hey, oh, wake up! Sleep deprivation. During all of this time, they measured how much movement they did, how much NEAT they did. And what they found is that for a given 24-hour period, if somebody was sleep deprived or not sleep deprived, they moved exactly the same. Okay? So the total movement for the day was the same, didn't change. During the sleep deprivation protocol, they gave people access to snacks. During normal sleep, they ate this number of snacks, but when they were sleep deprived, they ate 500 calories more as snacks. Like anyone who's been sleep deprived watching this knows that when you're tired, you eat more. We know that. But listen to what I said. So if you do scientific studies and you sleep deprive people, they don't move anymore. They're awake for longer, but they move the same, but they eat 500 calories more.
500, right?
It's huge. It's huge. And so now, imagine average Americans, right? All of us, right? And I bet you, a fifth of the people watching this know what sleep deprivation feels like. I can assure you, know I do. You know I do. Many of us are chronically sleep deprived. Many of us, therefore, are reaching out for those extra calorie opportunities. Nothing to do with the birthday cake, nothing to do with the stressful day. That's additional. This is just sleep deprivation. We're reaching out just because we're tired. We want to put something in our mouths. I confess, you know this, I got back from Minnesota last night just after 11. I was starving hungry, having only slept 3 hours the night before to get out to Minnesota. Right? We know this.
Let's end this with some
We're going to end?
Well, I know
we should talk. I want to talk forever.
You wanted to
We could talk for hours.
For 6 hours, but
I could talk
our
to you.
audience may not stick with us. Right?
But I could talk to you for hours.
Well, let's talk about the cube dwellers, the people who are desk jockeys.
Yes.
So forget about their boss for a minute.
If only they could. Yes.
Right. There are things that people can do during
Yes.
the course of their day to mitigate the lack of energy, and the caloric intake.
Yes. Okay. So there are several things anyone can do, right? And if you're watching this, these are some nice things.
And these are all science-based.
Well, these are. That's a great. Okay, have we got time? Let me just pick up on that because you've picked up on a very interesting how science is changing, and it's a subtle issue, but this is very interesting. One of the things you'll see how science is reported as you see the reports coming out. You're going to see this more and more and more. It's already happened. In the olden days, let's say one of the things you need to do instantly if you're watching this, if you've got food on your desk, remove it right now. I mean, now it's gone, and then go walk away from this show. It doesn't matter, right? But take food off your desk. Now you might say, show me the data for that specific intervention. And that's what people used to do. They used to do a study looking at that one little thing and see what would happen. They never showed anything. Now what you're going to see is the scientists in real world studies, not on those metabolic units, on real world studies, are going to say the best knowledge suggests that we do A, B, C, D, and E, and the intervention group who gets this best knowledge gets everything. Now, we don't know what works of those 5 little things, whether it's removing the food, getting up when the telephone goes off, and walking around, and walk and talk. We'll talk about that in a second. We don't know which one of those, but we know that as a collective, these things are associated with this outcome. Now, you might say, well, as a purist, as you are, or might be, a purist scientist might say, no, you should only change one little thing at a time and measure it. But the trouble is, if we actually did that, we would never be able to address the real concerns that my patients need us to address right now, today. Okay. So, to answer your question. So what I'm telling you is we've definitely done everything I'm about to say, and we've definitely published the results, but they're done en masse for exactly that reason. So first of all, for food, get food off your table right away. In terms of food, I actually have I think we could get them for you. I think I have the 10 commandments of food. And if you don't recognize what it is, you shouldn't be eating it, right? Organize your meals. Not everyone is a breakfast eater, but if you are a breakfast eater, get organized and have a breakfast. Do you know what I mean? But not everyone is a breakfast eater. And so on. Some people are snackers, so plan for that. If you get hungry when you get home at the end of the day, have an apple before you go home, right? So get organized with your food. Now, in terms of activity, things that universally work, walk and talk meetings are universally successful. I've met 5 journalists today. 4 out of 5 of those meetings were walk and talk. I was equally incoherent, regardless whether I was sitting or walking, and that's true of meetings. And in fact, walk and talk meetings are 11 minutes shorter on average than regular meetings, and they achieve just as little.
Oh, that's a good statistic right there.
And they achieve just as little. When the phone goes, simple things. And we actually used to do this with the red dot. You put a red dot on the phone, and when the phone goes, you see the red dot and you get up. So as soon as the phone goes, you get up, even if it's going to be an interview with somebody you need to take very careful written notes, but then you sit down again, but at least you got up. Right? But often when the phone goes and you get up, you can be pacing around on a long 2-meter cord, costs like $3. Right? You can be pacing up and down as you're talking to your editor, and obviously, I don't know how often you listen to your editors. Anyway, you get the idea. More sophisticated approaches, of course, are now using rising desks, flip-up desks, treadmill desks. Now, we never advocate for people to be standing still. That's not the point. We want people to be up and moving. And so, again, in an office environment, when people have standing desks, they move more because they're more interactive with people across the office from them. Individuals tend to do better when they actually can build into a movement program into these kind of things. So, again, if I may, I wrote a book called Get Up, which sort of lays all this out, and how we can change schools, how we can change cities, and how we can change offices. And what's interesting is the data coming in, and the theme is the same. people, of course, get healthier. Like, we didn't realize that, right? But also people are more productive. And we discussed this already. People are more productive at work and at school. And so, to me, that's what all of this teaches us, is that obesity isn't this negative thing that we need to hide and cower and have all these negative thoughts about, but really this is a massive health opportunity for the nation to grasp these health initiatives, many of which we know work, and reap the benefit from them.
Well, you heard it right here. Get up. So today we've heard from Dr. James Levine, a world-renowned expert on obesity issues from Mayo Clinic. You can find more resources to help you report on obesity issues at nationalpress.org.
Thank you so much. What a pleasure. What a pleasure.